Okay, so thank you everyone for coming. My name is Joseph Serrano, and I'm the organizers of this conference. I'm going to keep this introduction short so we can get started right. This conference was organized by the UC Berkeley Spinoza Studies Working Group with support from the UC Berkeley Townsend Center for the Humanities, the UC Berkeley Labor, Philosophy, and Change Working Group, as well as the Journal of Althusser Studies Décalage. In case you're interested in joining the Spinoza Working Group, please email us. I can put my email in the chat if you're interested. Next year, the group's activities are going to be dedicated to the theme of Spinoza and politics, which is a topic that's important for today. Okay, so I'll just say a few things about this conference. So this year, the working group read Hegel or Spinoza, a text in which Pierre Macherey asks us to rethink not only Hegel's readings and misreadings of Spinoza, but also points of convergence. Indeed, the convergence of Hegel and Spinoza allows Macherey to pose, but only to pose, the question of non-teleological dialectic of the positive, or perhaps materialist dialectic. As Macherey concludes the book, being able to pose even adequately, however, by no means guarantees that we will be able to answer it. In this conference, we will raise this question and others again, not simply or only as an academic exercise, but as a way of thinking, intervening, and perhaps producing effects within our own theoretical and political conjuncture. For Macherey, this is what it means to do philosophy in a materialist way. And like Macherey, our first presenter today was also a student and collaborator of Louis Althusser. Etienne Balibar is easily one of the most important philosophers of our time. Goes without saying that he has made many contributions to Marxism, scholarship, the history of philosophy, our current conjuncture, and of course, our understanding of Spinoza, as well as Hegel. As I mentioned, next year, the Spinoza Working Group is going to focus on Spinoza and politics. And we're definitely going to read some of Etienne's writings on the topic. For example, Spinoza, the anti-Orwell, Fear of the Masses, Spinoza in Politics, and the recently translated Spinoza as Individual. Etienne's topic is titled Verum Index sui et falsi, or the Spinozistic Detour of the Negation, according to Macherey. Okay, so Etienne, please begin.
Does it work? Yes?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes. Good. Wonderful. Let's hope I resolve some of the problems. One of them, I don't know how you do, guys, but when I need to read a paper, which is on my desk, and having to look at you or at the camera, it's not easy, but it's okay. So thank you, Joseph. Thank you very, very much to you and all the others, organizers and participants for inviting me to this conference. And of course, it's a great honor to be speaking to give the first presentation. For this conference celebrating Pierre Macherey's Hegel or Spinoza, I will adapt in English an oral presentation that I had offered in 2015 on the occasion of a previous celebration of the same book, but that was never published, jointly organized by some friends of ours, even some of them. One of them is here, Filippo De Lucchese, Chantal Jacquet, Warren Montag, Pierre-François Moreau, and Pascal Sévérac at the Sorbonne. The title has remained the same in the Latin original. Hegel or Spinoza was first published in French in the series created by Louis Althusser in 1979. It is now a classic which never disappeared from the academic reading lists all over the world. Its provocative thesis has become a model for a whole series of readings which confront philosophical works, I would say, sub specie actualitatis, Certainly, it can be used apart from the conjuncture in which it was written. Its knowledge, however, may add the knowledge of that conjuncture to the understanding of the intention and stakes of the book. I will examine this conjuncture through the following lens: the link that can be established between the celebrated Spinozistic sentence, Verum, index sui et falsi, and what had been the problematic of the so-called Spinoza group formed by Althusser and his students in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. What's happening? Affichage, and no longer gallery. Okay, here we are. In his Elements of Self-Criticism from 1974, Althusser writes, I quote, it's my translation. If we never, no, it's not my translation, sorry, it's Graham Locke's translation. If we never were structuralists, we can now explain why we seemed to be, even though we were not, why there came about this strange misunderstanding on the basis of which books were written. We were guilty of an equally powerful and compromising passion. We were Spinozists, in our own way, of course. End of quote. But who exactly is this we? At the very least, it must include Pierre Macherey and grant him a central place. In fact, we may safely defend that without Macherey's contribution, we would have never been Spinozists, or not in the same manner. So it would be much too simplistic to see in Macherey's later book from 1979 the postponed realization of Althusser's formula, stating that, I quote, again from Elements of Self-Criticism, in Spinoza's anticipation of Hegel, we tried to see and thought that we had succeeded in finding out under what conditions a philosophy might, in what it said or did not say, produce effects useful to materialism. Is the level okay? Do you hear me well? Not too loud? Okay, because I'm speaking very loud. Let us compare two texts or two passages. The first, which I need to quote at relative length, comes from Hegel or Spinoza in the final section of the chapter on More Geometrico, called with the subtitle Adequate and Inadequate Ideas. On page 66 of the English translation, we read, I quote, a very important consequence results from this. An idea cannot be more or less adequate in the way that a representation imitates its model more or less and can be itself measured by this degree of conformity. The theory of the adequate idea eliminates all normativity from the order of knowledge and simultaneously prevents the return of the finalist illusion that haunts classical theories of knowledge. The idea is totally adequate exactly to the extent that it is thereby necessary in the absence of all intervention of free will. This is the key to its objectivity. Spinoza expresses this in a provocative formula. All ideas are true insofar as they are related to God. That is, insofar as they are interpreted according to the causal necessity of the process that has engendered them. From this point of view, Macherey continues, all ideas are adequate. All ideas are true. That includes inadequate or confused ideas. False ideas are also true in their own way. This is why Spinoza writes Verum index sui et falsi. There is even in the nature of truth something that makes reference to the possibility of error and explains it. I skip a sentence. For Spinoza, by contrast to Descartes, the theory of error is immediately included within the theory of truth and helps to constitute it. False ideas are also singular ideas, and in both cases, the problem is to understand how they are necessarily produced. So Macherey in Hegel or Spinoza. Interestingly, Macherey would not have been able to write that, I quoted this before, the theory of the adequate idea eliminates all normativity from the order of knowledge if, instead of the sentence verum index sui et falsi, which features, as we know, in Spinoza's letter 74 to Albert Berg from 1675, he had quoted the variant featuring in Ethics Part 2, Proposition 43, veritas norma sui et falsi, often considered to mean the same. Why does Macherey give preference to verum index while joining it with a detailed commentary of the propositions in Ethics Part 2, which regard true and false ideas and the dependency of this opposition from the more fundamental doctrine of adequacy? For two reasons, I submit. Because it is more frequent in the discussions of German idealism since Jacobi and Mendelssohn onwards, and because it is the one chosen by Althusser when, together with the Habemus enim ideam veram from the Treatise on the Reform of the Understanding, he wants to indicate the opposition between Spinoza's philosophy of the production of knowledge and the so-called classical theories of knowledge, which search an a priori guarantee for the access to the truth, be it transcendental, metaphysical, or even dialectical. Hence the importance of another text which chronologically comes first. In his preface, I mean before Hegel or Spinoza, preface for Reading Capital 1965, Althusser had referred twice to an important article just published by Macherey, probably in agreement with himself, in French, à propos de la rupture, translated into English, but that you can find it online, but it's a corner by Ted Stolzer in 1986 in the Minneapolis Review or something like that. Yes, Minneapolis Review. And so Althusser quoted in Reading Capital from that earlier article by Macherey and commented it at the same time. Let me read two passages from Althusser's Reading Capital. First, a science only progresses, that is, lives, by the extreme attention it pays to the points where it is theoretically fragile. By these standards, it depends less on what it knows than on what it does not know. Its absolute precondition is to focus on this unknown and to pose it in the rigor of a problem. But the unknown of a science is not what empiricist ideology thinks, I skip, but par excellence, everything in it that sounds hollow, quote unquote, to an attentive ear despite its fullness. This is a literal quotation from Macherey's article. And especially a little further in his preface, I quote again Althusser, the fact that this will force us to pose the problem of the epistemological rupture for Marx as well considerably increases our task. I skip. We have to think in a completely novel way the relation between a science and the ideology which gave rise to it and which continues to accompany it silently, more or less throughout its history. I skip. Such an observation confronts us with the observation that every science can only be thought as a, quote, science of the ideology, unquote. This fact would disconcert us were we not forewarned of the nature of the object of knowledge, which can only exist in the form of ideology at the moment of constitution of the science, etc., etc. And then footnote, reference to Macherey's article. We may immediately notice that where Althusser, referring to Macherey in note, uses the term science and elaborates on the epistemological process of the constitution of the science and the traces or continuation it entails, Macherey systematically used the term theory or subordinated the term science to the more general category theory. I quote Spinoza, Macherey's article in Ted Stoll's translation. Spinoza is truly the first to have formulated theoretically the relationship between theory and ideology. I skip. If theory is always the theory of ideology, and if knowledge of the third kind always needs knowledge of the first kind, it's precisely because an idea is as real as it is intelligible, end of quote. In his original article, Macherey had written that maybe Althusser should have developed the allusions he twice made to Spinoza, which is, in fact, what Althusser seems now to be doing in Reading Capital. But in his retrospective commentary from 1999, so this is a reference to a book which I'm afraid is not translated into English. I show it to you here by Pierre Macherey, called Histoire de Dinosaures. It's a collection of his essays between 1965, 1997, with the subtitle that Joseph was referring to a moment ago, Faire de la philosophie, doing philosophy. And in this collection, Macherey includes, it's a fascinating book, I believe, a number of his essays from that period, each time introducing, explaining the circumstances and adding, of course, a commentary, a retrospective commentary. So in this, in the commentary to his 1965 essay, which in fact opens the collection, he's terribly self-critical, declaring that text to have been typically theoreticist, and also reproaching it with what he calls a schoolmaster's tone. And nevertheless, you find there some key clarifications, which I will translate as I can. To say the least, it was bizarre to present this replica of Auguste Comte's philosophie positive as the nec plus ultra of a theoretical Marxism. I skip. Bachelard, Coiré, Canguilhem, Foucault, becoming masters of Marxism, give me a break. Even more incongruous to have made Spinoza a partner in this operation. Macherey continues. This allows us to understand what kind of use we had at the time for Spinoza's philosophy and why it interested us so much. We used it as a weapon that we turned against a mechanical representation of the relationship between the real and the thought. And we saw in Spinozism an instrument to introduce a certain amount of internal dialecticity or dialectics into the understanding of this relationship. It may seem strange, but the hook we grasped in Spinoza's doctrine was a dialectical tendency we believed to find in it. In other terms, we didn't see so much there a naturalist ontology producing specific ethical effects than rather an historical epistemology in potentia, whose developments would destroy the structures of the classical theory of knowledge based on the opposition of the subject and the object. I skip. We read the ethics granting a privilege to part 2 because we hoped to find there a definition of thought immediately articulated with a certain practice of philosophy. End of quote. Now, allow me to ask, which practice of philosophy exactly? In the continuation of his retrospective commentary, Macherey precisely uses the Hegelian or quasi-Hegelian formula, the labor of the concept. And he also declares that this could illustrate a conception of philosophy as practice. I quote again from this commentary. What is a confrontation of ideas? Isn't it an internal confrontation highlighting the modality in which antithetic positions are proposed, where a common standard exists only if certain precise conditions are determined which do not precede or condition the debate, but arise from it, from its development. In some sense, we retrieve here Spinoza's idea when declaring that, quote, the true indicates itself and the false, verum index sui et falsi, in the same manner in which a light that illuminates itself also illuminates the darkness. I have big problems with the idea that light illuminates itself, but leave it for another circumstance. Which means that the relationship between true and false is not symmetric, since only the true has the power to disclose the non-truth of the false, which is also paradoxically its truth as falsity, since the negation or privation is nothing in itself, therefore cannot become appropriated in itself. Eventually, we are led to the idea that the false is only a form or modality of the true, an avatar of its expression or exposition that takes place in relation to the order of exposition and within its framework, where it is introduced through a retroactive operation. Althusser used to say, this is always Macherey, that in Spinoza's formula, verum index sui et falsi, the decisive element for the meaning is et falsi, because it eliminates every representation of truth as a solitary and victorious manifestation of itself, forgetting that truth only exists on the background of error. And later, in the same passage, in a certain sense, therefore, theory is always, quote, theory of ideology, unquote, as I had written, both because it succeeds ideology, which was its original terrain, and because it progressively creates a distance between ideology and itself as a result of its labor, and takes ideology as its own object. I tried to make this, Macherey writes, intelligible with a free paraphrase of Spinoza about the imagination of the sun distant 200 feet, etc., etc. End of quote. Finally, we are thus led to understand that in the guise of a self-criticism in 1999, Macherey is substantially vindicating and reasserting his position. He writes, the basic idea was right. Je touchais juste sur le fond, albeit implicitly closing down the distance between Hegel and Spinoza. The knowledge process is described, I quote, as a dynamic development arising from its internal contradictions. While the idea of finding in Spinoza a dialectical tendency, disposition à la dialectique, is attached to an interpretation of the epistemological break as a displacement with respect to ideology made possible through the assessment of its internal inadequacy. Is this not, we may ask, an equivalent of what Althusser in his preface to Reading Capital had called the knowledge effect, effet de connaissance, namely a partitioning in the field of knowledge between knowledge proper and the ideological element with which it is breaking. Hence, the Spinozistic doctrine that there is no communication between the real and the idea of this real becomes justified in terms of another idea attributed to Spinoza as an interpretation of Verum index sui. Science is a real transformation of false ideas into true ideas, or inadequate ideas into adequate ideas. It produces truth within knowledge through the understanding and displacement of ideological méconnaissance or ignorance, or better, I would suggest, misknowledge. We arrive at an understanding of the key formula, toute science est science de l'idéologie, every science or theory is a science or theory of ideology, which derives from this dialectical understanding of the Verum index sui et falsi. Is it okay? Yeah, I begin to have serious problems with my eyes, but we'll see if I. This dialectical understanding of Spinoza is vindicated against Hegel. It even makes Spinoza more of a dialectician than Hegel, at least another kind of dialectician. We are no longer here with the idea that it was arbitrary to read Spinoza like this. Perhaps internally transformed, this dialectical interpretation of Spinoza is there more than ever in Macherey's retrospective assessment. It has survived Macherey's self-criticism, targeting theoreticism, and the rejection of the dogmatic, survived the rejection of the dogmatic tone in which it had been initially proposed. In this remarkable stability, however, I see a problem with that rather than a solution, and I'm not saying, of course, that Macherey wouldn't see the problem himself. A problem with no simple solution, neither in Spinozistic nor in epistemological terms, in which Hegel will also continue to make our task harder and more interesting. Getting rid of Hegel, no easy task indeed. Let's try and investigate some of the dimensions of this difficulty. Firstly, we need a detour through the variation of Spinoza's formula between index sui and norma sui, both used and suppressed in the references that we just mentioned. This is no innocent difference. I'm sure we all agree on that. Some of the clues to our problem might lie there, in fact, since it proposes two models for the idea of the effectivity or efficacy of truth. On one side, the model of the manifestation to make the false or the error as such visible, perceptible. On the other side, the model of rectification, hence a conflict of antithetic values to rectify or correct the error. I'm not aware of many commentaries on this point, perhaps I missed something, but in any case, I believe it has to be inscribed in a long signifying chain leading, at least, from Aristotle, who in his De Anima, part 1, paragraph 5, writes that the right or the straight, etus, is judge, krites, of itself and the curved, campulum, and makes it possible for us to know both, not the reverse, of course. To Adorno, who reverses the formula, if Spinoza proclaimed the celebrated proposition verum index sui et falsi, we would declare that falsum index sui et veri in his introduction to dialectics from 1958, I believe. Owing to several commentators in the young generations, we may identify some of the intermediary links. According to Diego Tatian, they must include Marx's proposition in the 1843 manuscript on the critique of the Hegelian philosophy of the state. Democracy is the truth of monarchy, which makes it intelligible, but monarchy is not the truth of democracy. The change in supporting terms signals that the epistemological or logical proposition also frequently carries a political implication. If you read the series in Spinoza himself, there appears to be at the same time an equivalence and an exchange of functions. The normative formula, verum norma sui et falsi, goes with a context in which emphasis is put on the idea of the force as a privation, a missing adequacy of the idea, and error as confused knowledge, lacking clarity. Whereas the descriptive or demonstrative formula, verum index sui et falsi, goes along with what Deleuze calls the conflictual, polemical, political style of Spinoza, which also characterizes, of course, the theological political treatise, whose doctrine of democracy is grounded in the critique of the theological imaginary. Thus, norma is pointing towards a break of the intellect with error and the kind of knowledge which produces its falsity, whereas index is pointing towards the idea that imagination as a regime of fiction has the capacity to resist rationality, that it is not immaterial, dissipating in the presence of truth as fog in the morning at sunrise. Shall we translate the opposition into the language of ideology? We get an oscillation between the concept of ideology as the other of scientific or theoretical, hence true knowledge, and the concept of ideology as the object or one of the objects, but a necessary one of theoretical knowledge. Hence also the oscillation between what I would call a weak interpretation of Macherey's thesis, the one adopted by Althusser when quoting Macherey in 65, and a strong interpretation, Macherey's own interpretation, eventually reasserted in his later self-criticism, which also illuminates the oscillation between the two categories, science versus theory. In the theoreticist doctrine of reading capital and the Althusserian group at the time, it is theory which carries the strong meaning, whereas science carries only the weak one. In theory, as we know, the functions of science and philosophy, hence implicitly, at least politics, are combined. We may now return to the relations between epistemology and dialectics, focusing on the question of error with its negative and affirmative sides. Shall we say, as Macherey once did, that French epistemology imagined a dialectics of the production of knowledge arising from the continuous correction of error? It seems to me that the answer needs to be nuanced. Different authors in the canonical list must be treated separately. So I skip a passage on Coiré, Canguilhem, and Cabayes because I no longer have much time, and I just come to the last person in the list. In the work of Bachelard only do we find the clear expressions of an epistemological primacy of error, as had been argued in the same period by another Althusser student, Dominique Lecourt, who passed away a few weeks ago. De facto, the Bachelardian notion of pre-scientific knowledge as a tissue of resilient and interconnected errors, un tissu d'erreurs tenaces et solidaires, did serve the Althusserians to indicate one of the dimensions of ideology and retroactively its function as an epistemological obstacle. In his quotation of Macherey, Althusser comes very close to this Bachelardian dialectics, as he explains that the epistemological break is distributed over time in the process of scientific knowledge, where the overcoming of error forms the reverse side of the continuous process of knowledge and is constitutive of it. Another important point is the following. In renaming error as ideology, Althusser certainly gets rid of the psychologism, but things are less clear with regard to Bachelar's pedagogism or pedagogic ideology, or his insistence on the educative function of scientific knowledge for the mind. It is fairly possible to assert that theoreticism is a cover for a deeper and more problematic pedagogism, or, if you like, dogmatism. Far from it being eliminated when the function of theory was tentatively stripped from its positivistic overtones and subjected to a political notion of the class struggle in theory, aiming at rectifying the deviations from materialism in the field of knowledge, this pedagogism became even stronger. It is only, I believe, in the constellation of short essays from 1976, particularly his preface to Lecour's book on Lysenko, A Proletarian Science, that Althusser would arrive at the idea of, I quote, a heuristic primacy of error over truth that would force us paradoxically, I quote again Althusser, to speak of error without truth and deviations without norm, an idea which owes more to certain passages in Pascal in his theological disputes than to Spinoza or Hegel. To speak of pedagogy and pedagogism, however, means that values are at stake. This is a category that Althusser tried to avoid, but that plays a central role in Bachelard and also in Canguilhem, when scientific knowledge which established facts confronts and rectify errors, it becomes itself a value or value-carrying, value-loaded activity. We might even speak, you see whom I have in mind, with Nietzsche, of the will to truth immanent in the destruction of errors and its problematic relationship with life. So despite precautions that may be observed in order not to identify normativity with normality or normalization, the epistemological questions are subsumed under moral judgments. Norma and index signal an irreducible tension. At this point, and I know that I need to finish, before finally returning to Spinoza, we need a second detour, which I will make as quick as possible, this time to some aspects of the Hegelian legacy. More than ever, a strong attraction towards the Hegelian dialectics of the power of the negative, and in Gérard Lebrun's formulation, its patience, is taking place in this representation of knowledge as a process in which the becoming of truth must include the Aufhebung or sublation of error as the negative. We may see here, look particularly at the formulas in the preface to Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, which I skip because that would be too long, with the exception of a single sentence. Hegel, on the other hand, in conceptual thinking, as we have already shown, the negative belongs to the content itself, and is the positive, both as the immanent movement and determination of the content and as the whole of this process. Looked at as a result, what emerges from this process is the determinate negative, which is consequently a positive content as well. In the phenomenology, despite the objective of thinking the substance as subject, and conversely, Hegel did not ontologize the movement of truth, or he would ontologize it only inasmuch as he identified being with process, becoming, absolute method, etc. But he certainly eliminated the moralism, which was associated with the isolation of the false, or a falsity that is mere falsity existing as such abstractly. There remains, of course, a constitutive relationship between knowledge and pedagogy, since theory is a formation, Bildung, the formation of its subject as well as the emergence of a form. But this pedagogy is universalized, as it were, it becomes transferred to universal history. Obviously, it is in the idea that there is an intrinsic positivity of the force when considered from the angle of its overcoming in knowledge, arising from its negation, that we can find at the same time the greatest vicinity and the strongest opposition to Spinoza. This is exactly Macherey's point in Hegel or Spinoza, page 72, and I skipped the quotation. Let me arrive at a final, really final consideration. What neither Macherey in his 1965 article nor Althusser in his quotation of it at the time really explained was the understanding of what is an error, or what remains of the idea of the dialectical idea of the false when the teleology of the becoming subject of the substance as an interiorization of the real to its own concept is rejected. Perhaps we can try and clarify this crucial point on the basis of Macherey's development in Hegel or Spinoza on inadequate and adequate idea, where the formula Verum index sui et falsi is invoked. This would be something like a properly Spinozistic doctrine of the function of error in knowledge, be it at the level of individual knowledge or learning, or more interestingly at the level of the common notions which involves an interaction of error and knowledge in the development of science. The first thing we could say is that Spinoza's constant rejection of the idea of negativity does not exhibit a subtraction or a lack, but corresponds to the introduction of something else, which we may call, I suggest this, I'm not even sure the words exist in English, but I propose the neologisms, assertivity or dialectical affirmativity. Of course, this becomes clearer if we read Spinoza after reading Hegel. Affirmativity lies in the fact that for Spinoza, a transition from the first to the second and third kinds of knowledge is neither a negation nor a rejection of those ideas which, in the light of the true, appear to be false. Rather, it is a way of extracting from the false idea its affirmative content and assert it as such or make it perceptible. Readers of Deleuze can't be surprised by such an interpretation. It is obviously related to the idea that if error certainly is nothing positive, nevertheless, all ideas, including false ideas, are true in God's understanding, where sub specie aeternitatis they are connected to their first cause. We know that this doesn't mean that ideas exist in a heaven of ideas or vision en Dieu. It means that false ideas are concatenated with the same necessity as true ideas themselves, which for that reason provide and exhibit a norm of intelligibility common to all ideas. Their essences and existences possess a necessity which they do not understand themselves, but which can be perceived and asserted as such. This true understanding of the necessity of false ideas or their order of connection that defines the method that leads to the thesis of adequacy as an intrinsic character of ideas. Truth and falsity are qualities or properties of ideas and their connections that are never external, they never a relation to something other than themselves. Hence, to assert the false ideas means to form an adequate idea of inadequacy itself, or to actively bring adequacy, that is necessity, into the inadequate idea within the element of thought. But this, I'm done. This leads to a more enigmatic question. Does Spinoza, in the bulk of his work, really follow his own method? Or does he do what he says he does? What must be done following the normativity or the orientation towards the intelligence of the inadequate, a conatus, in fact? I would say, once again, yes and no, because I have the feeling, and I know there's a little bit of subjectivity there, that a décalage will remain in his explanations between the level of affects and the level of ideas of the first kind, images or fictions. Clearly, the objective of the whole argument in the ethics summarized in proposition 10 of part 5 is to grant the affective life an intelligible order, ordinem ad intellectum, which neutralizes their constant oscillations. In this process, the conceptual interest for the thought content of the false ideas seems to be lost or marginalized, neglected. A way to retrieve it, however, would be to apply again the Deleuzian suggestion according to which there are, in fact, different styles or modalities of exposition in the ethics, one producing demonstrations, the other polemical or political, targeting moral and theological ideologies, which express in a discursive manner necessary illusions arising from the finitude of the human individual. If we confer full relevance to the analogy between the teleological illusions criticized and explained in the appendix to part 1 of the ethics, typically a polemical political text, and the theological fictions analyzed in the theological political treatise, we exactly subsume these fictions under the program or method of intelligibility, which forms a theory of error as affirmation of the affirmative content of the force. We may even suggest that this is the normative criterion of the third kind of knowledge, a synthetic knowledge never immediate, whose dialectical and also active offensive content is an idea of idea, not in a static representational sense, whereby one idea would happen to be the object of another idea, but in the active performative sense, Macherey, again, page 79, one idea makes a difference in another idea and knows or reflects that it makes this difference. As a consequence, norma or index sui et falsi becomes a formula for a dialectical understanding of the Spinozistic notion of the idea of idea as it is effectively practiced by Spinoza, although dispersed in different parts of his work. Sorry for the length. Thank you for not cutting me. I'm very sorry about that. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Etienne, for that talk. So if you have any questions or comments, just put them in the chat and then we'll talk about those after these next 3 presentations. Okay, so next we have a Spinoza group regular, a Kiarina Kordela. Kiarina is a professor of German studies at Macalester College. Her talk today, Spinoza and Hegel, expands on some of the ideas that she writes about in her recent book, Epistemontology, Spinoza, Freud, Marx, Lacan, the biopower of structure, which which came out in 2018. Okay.
Joseph, can you, I realize I forgot to ask you to make me a co-host so that I can do the PowerPoint.
Oh, sure, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Can I do it?
Yeah.
What is it? Share screen. Share screen. Share, and then I go to view slides. So can you all see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. And I'm honored to be invited by this group of Berkeley to talk amid this illustrious company. All the more so, as I had explained from the outset, that I will not have anything essentially new to say. So what I'm doing in the following is to present certain positions which to some of you may be familiar, but I'm going to do it as a homage to Macherey's book, Hegel or Spinoza, by which I mean that I shall construct the following line of thought by drawing closely and primarily on this book. In contrast to substance, whose essence necessarily entails its existence, singular things do not exist necessarily, and therefore their existence and their essence are determined in completely different manners. Their existence is determined according to a negative or external determination, whereas their essence is determined according to a positive or internal determination, whereby both determinations are expressions of one and the same substance. In other words, the same things are determined from different points of view, from that of eternity and from that of linear time. In one case, a finite thing is determined according to its essence, following which it tends indefinitely to preserve its being. In the other case, it is determined according to its existence in the conditions that limit it. Within time, model existence appears as a transitive succession of individual constraints whose existence is explained by an order of negative determinations which remains exterior to essences which are eternal. This is exactly the particular situation of singular things. They have their own essence, which is given within them, and in which substance expresses itself certo e determinato modo, and they exist in exteriority in an interminable sequence that links them to all other things. This is why the fact that singular things do not exist in eternity has no effect at all on the eternity of their essence. If with Spinoza, determination can be understood simultaneously in a positive and a negative sense, it is because this notion does away with the traditional opposition of positive and negative. In fact, one of the most central and radical innovations that Spinoza's reasoning introduces into philosophy is the general elimination of traditional oppositions, including that between thought and matter. This is the meaning of Spinoza's statement that the order and the connection of ideas are the same as the order and connection of things. This statement postulates a homology between thought and extension, and for that matter, a homology among all other attributes, since substance has infinite attributes. But a homology that does not in the least compromise the radical difference among all these attributes. It is this homology that entails the need to introduce the term epistemology, by which I mean that the order and the connections pertaining to epistemology are the same as the order and connections pertaining to ontology. And the reason why this homology among all attributes exists is precisely that beyond all external or negative determinations between attributes, there are internal determinations between each attribute and substance. This is actually equally true of any mode, which too, beyond all its external determinations, is internally determined according to the immanent necessity that engenders it within substance, that is, according to its eternal self-determination. In this way, its attribute expresses the same substance, or more accurately, it is the same substance that exists as its attribute. In short, the order and connections of all modes of its attribute is the same as the order and connections of all modes of any other attribute, in spite of all their differences. In Montag's pithy observation, Warren Montag's pithy observation, the theoretical effect here is not to declare everything the same, but to render it irreducible to anything prior to or outside of itself, of which it would be the expression or representation. Here, Montag foregrounds the fact that extension, thought, and any other attribute is not an expression or representation of substance, but rather it is substance. In contrast to Hegel's misreading of Spinoza, according to which, as Macherey remarks, Spinoza is supposed to emulate the Oriental conception of emanation, in which the absolute is the light that not only illumines itself, but also emanates. Its emanations are distancing and Entfernungen from its undimmed clarity. The successive productions are less perfect than the preceding ones from which they arise. That is, the process of emanation is a becoming only as a progressive loss. For Spinoza, by contrast, emanation is an imaginary notion, as are all numbers, which is why God is not one any more than he is two or three or beautiful or ugly, and consequently, to understand monism as something that is the opposite of dualism is possible only as long as we rely on our power to imagine, which creates a fiction, not simply of two, three, or any other number of substances, but more generally of substances existing in a determinate number. This is why substance can be conceived only as absolutely undifferentiated, as an absolutely undifferentiated potentiality to actualize itself in its modes through which it exists in the first place. The homology among the infinite attributes in their radical otherness means that even if they are in reality distinct, or rather exactly because they are in reality distinct, they are not like beings that could be enumerated, even in a perspective tending towards the infinite, because this would act to reduce their distinction to a modal distinction. That is, in a certain way, to think about the infinite from a finite point of view. It is this imaginary sense of monism that Macherey rejects insofar as to say there is a single substance. Oh, where am I? Even what happened? Suddenly I cannot move the PowerPoint is stuck. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, but the PowerPoint is stuck. I cannot move the, oh, okay, sorry. So if anything happens, because I'm not really, I'm trying to deal between the PowerPoint and my paper, please somebody speak up and tell me whatever, we cannot hear you or whatever. So I was saying, it is this,
do you still want to share do you still want to share your PowerPoint? We can't see it anymore.
Okay, thank you. I have to go back to Zoom. So, do you hear also a little link that happens every here and then, or am I the only one that hears that? I am
We
the only
hear
one.
it.
You hear it too? You hear it too? No,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
don't. Some say yes, some say no. Go figure. Okay. Yeah, did you hear it now?
Oh, it's because you're a co-host, so you can hear when people enter and leave.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay, got it. Got it. So I go back to share screen. View slideshow. How do I do that? Why? Oh, there. Share. And then slideshow. Oh shit, it starts from the beginning. I am on 13. Let's see, will it do it if I go there? 13. View slideshow. Oh, okay. How does this say? Okay. Is it fine?
Yes.
Thank you. It is this imaginary sense of monism that Macherey rejects insofar as to say there is a single substance is to speak from the imagination that can only consider the absolute negatively, and therefore it must be said that Spinoza was no more profoundly a monist than a dualist or whatever other number one. To say that substance consists of infinite attributes, each of which expresses an eternal and infinite essence, is a statement that obliterates the opposition between monism and dualism, since numbers pertain to the imaginary and the modal perspective, not to the perspective of sub specie aeternitatis. As Macherey puts it, there is only one substance, but it comprises an infinity of attributes. Its unity is incomprehensible outside this infinite diversity, which constitutes it intrinsically. The result is that substance has multiplicity within itself and not outside itself. And from this fact, multiplicity ceases to be numerical, which Spinoza expresses exactly by saying it is infinite. In effect, for him, infinity is not a number to the extent that it cannot be represented by the imagination. We are here poles apart, we can see, from the project of a philosophical calculus of the mechanical enumeration of parts that formally constitute a being, to which more geometrical. It is for this reason that it is laughable to present the Spinozist monism as a supersession of Cartesian dualism. The mode of thought put to work by Spinoza produces its effects on a completely different terrain, where these old questions of philosophy are simply invalid. Because it is often misunderstood, let us return once again to Spinoza's key new reasoning, which is the thesis of the identity of the attributes in substance, in which they are unified at the same time as they remain really distinct. This unity is expressed in a well-known proposition: the order and the connections of ideas are the same as the order and connections of things. This proposition is often interpreted as if it forms a relationship of agreement between everything that depends on thought and on extension. Such an interpretation is inadmissible. In effect, if in this statement the word ideas truly designates the modes of the attribute of thought, the word things, res, absolutely does not, in a restrictive way, designate the modes of the attribute of extension, but the modes of all the attributes, whatever they are, including thought itself. Ideas are just as much things as some other affection of substance, whatever. The proposition thus signifies that everything that is included in an attribute, that is in any form of being, whatever it is identical to that which is included in all the other attributes exactly in the same manner that it is identical to itself. In returning to itself, and notice that here Macherey is replicating the Hegelian mode of speaking, in returning to itself without escaping its own order, thought discovers everything that is contained in substance, inasmuch as it expresses itself in the infinity of all its attributes. The assertion that, and I repeat Macherey's words from the passage you just saw, here is again the passage that I'm repeating. So the assertion that, and I repeat Macherey's words, the word things absolutely does not, in a restrictive way, designate the modes of the attribute of extension, but the modes of all the attributes, whatever they are, including thought itself. Ideas are just as much things as some other affection of substance, whatever it may be. So this assertion entails, among many other things, that things think. And to say this without uttering a sheer nonsense presupposes having understood that not all thought is conscious. This is precisely what eludes Hegel. And I'm quoting from Macherey again, quoting Hegel. With Spinoza, there is an orientation toward an absolute understanding. And what it corresponds to, a circular represent, according to Hegel, is the concept which gives the entire doctrine its rational foundation. The first of this is Hegel. The first of Spinoza's definition is that of causa sui, conceptualized as this, cuius essentia involvit existentiam. The inseparability of the concept from being is the main point and fundamental hypothesis in his system. End of quote. In effect, with the causa sui, an identity is immediately posed between what is and what is understood, conçu, between being and thought, which is for Hegel the condition of an absolute thought that has nothing outside itself and that consequently develops itself within an immanent and universal reflection. Again, I'm repeating passages from this citation. Absolute understanding, the identity between being and thought, an absolute thought that has nothing outside itself, is possible only if things think. Because if things didn't think, then things would be outside thought. So if things think, this is possible only if thought is not reducible to consciousness or the human subject. As Gilles Deleuze put it, the model of the body, according to Spinoza, does not imply any devaluation of thought in relation to extension, but, much more important, a devaluation of consciousness in relation to thought, a discovery of the unconscious, of an unconscious of thought, just as profound as the unknown of the body. In fact, if Hegel associated Spinoza's thought with the Orient, it is precisely because he could not understand that an absolute thought that has nothing outside itself includes the unconscious of thought, that is precisely substance without a subject. And it is because of this error that Hegel can identify, as Macherey extensively shows, both the Orient and Spinoza as a primitive beginning or origin, as is evident in the following passage from Macherey. In Hegel, the Orient is the visible figure of that which begins. This figure is more mythical than historical, but is not myth the most appropriate form of exposition for origin? It is the moment where the absolute is affirmed for the first time in substance that excludes the individuality of a subject. In Oriental thought, the principal relationship is as follows. The single substance is as such the true, and the individual in himself is without value and has nothing to gain for himself insofar as he maintains his position against that which is in itself for itself. He cannot, on the contrary, have any real value without confounding himself with his substance, the result of which is that substance ceases to exist for the subject, and that the subject itself ceases to be a conscious being and vanishes within the unconscious. Instead of grasping that far from being a primitive origin, the unconscious is the absolute infinite intellect, something produced immediately by God, while consciousness requires a further determination, that is, it is produced not immediately by God, but by the mediation of some infinite modification, not unlike the face of the whole universe, which also varying in infinite ways, yet remains always the same. This is the consequence of the conception of substance as causa sui, a conception that constitutes the core presupposition for secular thought, that is, a thought that does not presuppose a creator of being or substance. Substance can be conceived by secular thought only as self-caused, that is, as the power or potential of being to actualize itself. For if being were not the power of bringing itself into existence, then there should be something else prior to it that created it. The corollary of the concept of substance qua causa sui is that God is unconscious, which Lacan notoriously discerned as the true formula of atheism. And this, by the way, relates entirely to Balibar's talk right now about the issue, the relation between error and truth, and the fact that truth should not, or ideology should not be understood as something subsidiary, let alone opposite of truth. Hopefully we'll have the time to discuss that later. So, moreover, Macherey's distinction between external and internal determinations is no more an alternative from which one can choose than the pair historical determinism conceived as either necessity or contingency, and self-determination. So historical determinism, self-determination conceived as either free will or fate. These two determinations, far from excluding each other, are both operative in anything. The negative from the perspective of time, Hegel's concept, the positive from the perspective of eternity, Spinoza's concept. The difference is not that between error and truth, or if you wish, the difference is precisely that between error and truth, in the Spinozian sense, according to which, and I'm quoting the passage from the Ethics that Etienne Balibar just quoted, but he also quoted from the letter where it is the index and not the norm. And with all respect for all the distinctions made, if I am going to accept the point that you, Etienne, just made, that my point is precisely that the primacy should not be given to the truth, as if on the contrary. In fact, I have not quoted, if I had heard your talk, I would also have quoted another line from Lacan, namely, that's only by lying that I can tell the truth. So for Spinoza, there is no doubt that time is a product of the imagination and hence false. But the false is as much an index of truth as is truth itself, which is why to select only one of the two perspectives, either time or eternity, would amount to missing part of the truth. Similarly, would also miss part of the truth if we read the or in Macherey's title Hegel or Spinoza in the exclusive sense, as in either or. Rather, we should read it in the same sense that substance can exist as thought or extension or any other attribute. That is, it can exist as thought and extension and any other attribute. Hence, the question is not to choose between Hegel or Spinoza, but to learn how to read both Hegel and Spinoza. While from the perspective of the imaginary, we can speak of either Spinoza or Hegel, having on the one hand a presumed monism and on the other hand an exclusive Hegelianism, a true monism has nothing outside itself. Therefore, once again, Spinoza and Hegel. To take into account both aspects of being amounts, repeating Macherey's words, to grasping determination simultaneously in a positive and a negative sense, and hence doing away with the traditional opposition of positive and negative. If positive and negative determinations are not opposites, neither are Hegel and Spinoza. I think it is this relation between Hegel and Spinoza, because of which Macherey refers very early in his book to a paradoxical effect. Hegel is never so close to Spinoza as in the moments when he distances himself from him, because this refusal has the value of a symptom and indicates the obstinate presence of a common object, if not a common project, that links these two philosophers inseparably without conflating them. And this is also why Macherey can formulate a core logic within Spinoza's entire philosophical system in the Hegelian parlance. Imitating the style of Hegelian discourse, we could say that the relationship between the substance and the attributes is identity, having become that in which the absolute affirms itself as actual. And this process is that of the causa sui, or if you will, the return of substance to itself. Except, of course, that Hegel looks at this return from the perspective of development in time, whereas Spinoza, while fully well knowing that this is how the imaginary functions in terms of time, nevertheless, Spinoza looks at it from the perspective of eternity or logic, where the return of substance to itself occurs as much instantaneously as eternally. Thank you. And I can stop sharing.
Thank you, Kiarina. Okay, so let's keep moving on. So the next talk is going to be by Vittorio Morfino, who's associate professor in the history of philosophy at the University of Milano Bicocca. His most recent book to be translated in English is the Spinoza Machiavellian Counter, Time and Occasion, which is also available now in paperback from Edinburgh University Press. And his paper today is called Causa sui and Organism, Spinoza's interpretation of Hegel's Kantian moment. Okay.
So thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Warren, for having invited me today in this conference. It's a pleasure to discuss with you all the book of Macherey. So on the occasion of this conference on Macherey's book, Hegel ou Spinoza, I have decided to present the results of a research carried out a few years ago on the Hegelian interpretation of Spinoza, which was not only inspired by Macherey, but I would say totally imbued with Macherey. Unlike Macherey, who takes into account the Hegelian reading of Spinoza in the synchrony of his mature work, I have attempted to reconstruct several layers of the encounter with Spinoza's philosophy, identifying different stages, trying to pinpoint the moment in which an original interpretation was established. For reasons of time, I can only offer the results of my research without the detailed analysis. If we wish to identify the, if we wish to identify, I need some lights. If we wish to identify the different phases marking Hegel's reception of Spinoza, we could detect the following three periods. The first phase which is characterized by an inadequate knowledge of Spinoza's philosophy. Hegel was first introduced to Spinoza's philosophy in the course of his debates with Hölderlin and Schelling on Jacobi's letters in the Stift of Tübingen. Subsequently, Hegel encountered it through the letters, and in Schelling's case, the works of that period of the two fellow students on the relationship between Fichte and Spinoza, highlighting the relevance of the latter to a redefinition of criticism. Finally, Hegel finds Spinoza in Hölderlin, Zwilling, and Sinclair's discussion on pantheism in Frankfurt. At this point, Spinoza plays no specific role in Hegel's theory, aside from being a generic pantheist antidote to Kant's dualism. En kai pan, ich weiß nicht anders. The second phase begins with an encounter with and study of Spinoza's text, brought about by a marginal collaborative role in the Paulus edition of Spinoza's works. Faith and knowledge, Glauben und Wissen in particular, but also the essay on skepticism, displays a deep familiarity with Spinoza's ethics, the letters and the principles of Descartes philosophy. In this period, Spinoza features as the champion of rationality, and Hegel uses his theory of the infinite actu against a vast range of philosophers of the understanding, from Locke to Hume, to the Enlighteners, and to the philosopher of common sense, and again against Jacobi, Kant, and Fichte. What defines Spinoza's philosophy is here no longer the romantic blurred image of the Enkaipan, but a specific reference to the fundamental concepts of Spinoza's metaphysics, which Hegel amply uses in the philosophical battles of the times of Vienna. Finally, a third phase is more than outlined in the logic and metaphysics of Vienna, and programmatically expounded in the phenomenology of the spirit. This amounts to an incorporation and overcoming, Aufhebung, of the Spinozian moments of substance in Hegel's system. But what does it mean to say that substance must become subject? A passage from the spirit of Christianity and its destiny may help us understand the ideological assumption of this statement. I quote, "When Jesus said, 'The Father is in me and I in the Father, who has seen me has seen the Father, who knows the Father knows that what I say is true, and that I and the Father are one,' the Jews accused him of blasphemy because he, born a man, made himself God. How could they have recognized something divine in a man? They, the poor, who carried with them only the consciousness of their misery, their profound servitude, their opposition to the divine, the consciousness of an unbridgeable abyss between human and divine. Only the Spirit recognized the Spirit. They saw in Jesus only the man, the Nazarene, the carpenter's son, whose brothers and relatives lived among them. So much was he, nor could he have been more. He was only one like them, and they themselves felt that they were nothing. The lion does not dwell in a nut, nor the infinite spirit in the prison of a Jewish soul, nor the whole of life in a dry leaf." End of quote. Firstly, this statement can be read through the lenses of the difference between Judaism and Christianity. in Christianity. In line with the Hebrew religion, Spinoza posits an abyss between God and man, that is, between substance and modes, and grants no mediation between finite and infinite, a mediation that in Christianity is found on the figure of Jesus Christ, the Word that becomes flesh. In other words, the absolute cannot simply enjoy eternity. Instead, it must achieve consciousness of it in absolute knowledge through a temporal process that is internal to human history. As the God of the Vorstellung of Christian religion must become man in his son Jesus, so the absolute must embody itself in the history of humankind in order to reach self-consciousness. Rather than the Catholic Church, that is a bureaucratic institution, the whole of human history thus becomes the mediation between the infinite and the finite. What is absent from Spinoza's theory is precisely the historical and progressive dimension of humankind, and on this basis, Hegel accuses Spinoza of acosmism. But religious prejudice alone is not sufficient to explain Hegel's misunderstanding of Spinoza. The latter must necessarily be inserted into into an interpretative error. This error can be found in faith and knowledge, where Hegel overlaps Spinoza's conceptual pair imagination-intellect with his own pair reflection-reason. In this text, Hegel identifies the question of the finite with that of the imagination, which represents the finite as separate from totality. Hegel believes that Spinoza understands the finite and time as illusions produced by the imagination that disappear as soon as the standpoint of substance and eternity is assumed. Here lies the very reason behind Hegel's critique of acosmism. The world that is the finite and time is nothing but an illusion produced by the imagination. But this critique, phrased by Hegel later, is more applicable to Hegel's early philosophy of the Jena period than to Spinoza's theory. Hegel misunderstands Spinoza's notion of the imagination, or rather he only uses it in a very reductive way. The ensemble of terms linked to the verb imaginare has a complex semantic role in Spinoza's system, as is well known. The concept of the imagination is built across different but interconnected levels: the epistemological, the physiological, the psychological, the anthropological and ethical, and finally, the theological political level. It will suffice here to remember the main aspects, and I'm quoting Michel Bertrand, that Spinoza does not oppose the imaginary to reality, but rather the reality of the imaginary to that of physical external events. Of this complex theory, Hegel only retains the epistemological aspects, and of that only a part. Whilst he retained the element whereby the imagination conceives of finite individuals as standing as such outside of the necessary fabric which links them to divine immanent causality, he completely removes the anti-teleological core of Spinoza's argument, according to which the imagination is an apparatus of inversion of causes into ends. Therefore, for Hegel, once the illusion of the imagination is removed, time and the finite also disappear into eternity and the infinite, and the latter are the only objects of reason. In fact, the true does not eliminate the imaginary, because, as Bertrand aptly puts it, man never stops belonging to the imaginary, even when he constantly seeks to discover, through knowledge, the structure of the universe or his own singular truth. End of quote. Hegel contends that once imaginary knowledge is overcome, aufhebt, time is annihilated in the simultaneous eternity of the absolute. Absolute zugleich is the word of Hegel. In his interpretation of Spinoza's theory, Hegel built the pair of opposite time eternity at the price of removing a fundamental element, the concept of duration. In letter 12, Spinoza builds a symmetrical correspondence between the pair substance mode and the pair eternity duration. The concept of time is only introduced later in this letter, alongside that of number and measure, as an auxilium imaginationis. Time is the abstract measure of the continuous flow of modal existence itself, which Spinoza names duration. This means that the modes have an individual history which, thought knowable sub specie eternitatis, cannot be absorbed into the eternal simultaneity of substance. To use Spinoza's example from chapter 3 of the Theological Political Treatise on the Jewish people, having demonstrated the imaginary character of the myth of the election that hovers over the whole great historical narrative of the Old Testament, the material history, that is to say the duration of the Jewish people, which includes the imaginary history understood as meaning rather than as truth, does not fall into the night of simultaneity, but becomes an object of knowledge in its individuality. Chapter 17. So, whilst in Hegel's early Jena period, there is no concept of history, in Spinoza, history is present, as we have seen, at two different levels. In the first kind of knowledge, as the great historical narrative of a people, as theological and or eschatological history, and this is how individuals imagine their own temporality. And in the third kind, as knowledge of the material and imaginary process of the history of the people in its duration. Whilst in Hegel of the Jena period, time is negated, suppressed, deleted, and eternal, in the Macherey Hegel, time becomes the unfolding of the eternal, that he will only know one of the two levels present in Spinoza. The first one, where historicity is teleological anthropomorphism and ideological narration. All in all, Hegel's philosophy of history is this, we can say that is the secularization of the Jewish myth of election put into motion in the history of the spirit. This is why Hegel is right to say that Spinoza is a cosmistic. And yet Spinoza is not so in the way Hegel intended this term. This is to say that the word is absent in Spinoza, but rather he is a cosmistic insofar as the cosmos is missing in Spinoza, that is an ordering of anthropomorphic values that assigns meaning, a direction to the necessary development of aleatory historical events. Once the myth of election and providence are deconstructed, for Spinoza, there is nothing but the aleatoriness of necessity. Let us go back to the thread of the argument on Hegel's interpretation of Spinoza. The decisive moment of Hegel's interpretative path is clearly marked by his encounter with Spinoza's texts. However, at this point, we need to be very alert because Hegel imposes ab origine a powerful conceptual framework onto Spinoza's letter. And from this, he confers a set of meanings to a series of fundamental formulations of Spinoza's metaphysics. Hegel reads Spinoza after Kant, and this is an historical fact. He reads him against Kant, and as often been pointed out by critics, but above all, he reads him through Kant. The question Hegel comes to confront is one dominated by the limitation imposed on reason by Kant's legislative work on human knowledge. Totality, in its subjective, objective, and absolute forms, lie beyond the field of application of the categories as a negative limit and regulative function of scientific research. For Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, God is a necessary illusion of reason. When confronted with Kant's separation of phenomenon and noumenon, of being and thought, Hegel finds in the history of Western thought a philosophy conceived of as an answer to Descartes' fundamental question on the relationship between res cogitans and res extensa. Spinoza's philosophy of one substance, that is both God and the world, thought and extension, is the most powerful theoretical antidote to Kant's splitting of the finite and the infinite. However, the position of a unique substance, that is immanent cause of its effect, while solving the problem of the relationship between being and thought, also constitutes a real scandal for a tradition of Western metaphysics that, since Aristotle, had conceived of substance on the basis of an anthropomorphic model of the finite individual. When faced with Spinoza thought, Pierre Bayle was horrified at its negation of Aristotle's principle of contradiction. The note N to the entry on Spinoza in the Historical and Critical Dictionary, Bayle drew attention to this aspect of Spinoza thought. According to him, the role of a unique infinite substance immanent to its modification violates Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction, and in doing so, it surpasses the monstrosity and ravings of the craziest minds ever locked up in a madhouse, end of quote. But what is crazy and unthinkable for Bayle became conceivable for Hegel through Kant and against him. Spinoza's substance is causa sui. Hegel frequently insists on this aspect of Spinoza's theory. He interprets this formula as a fundamental postulate of reason, the unity of the opposites of being and thought. This he does against Kant, of course, against the splitting of phenomenon and noumenon, against the unknowability of the things in itself postulated in the Critique of Pure Reason, but also through Kant, that is, through the theory of an archetypical intellect outlined in the Critique of Judgment, according to which thought and being, possibility and reality are one in the divine creative intelligence. Divine substance thinks and therefore exists, and this thought overcomes the limits of the Kantian intellect to become reason. Far from rejecting Kant's problematic, Hegel wholly assumes it in a new perspective. Kant's antinomies no longer refer to an illusory subject, but to a real subject, are turned into contradiction, and God becomes the supreme contradictory unity of thought and being, of finite and infinite, freedom and necessity, form and essence. For Hegel, Spinoza's substance is the absolute contradiction, the logos of metaphysical tradition that, in order to survive Kant's condemnations, crosses the pillar of Hercules of its problematic field. As logos, that is, meaning of reality, substance is also its own end. A close analysis shows that Hegel himself links the concept of causa sui to that of immanent cause, something that is not at all evident to the tradition, and often states that what is cause of itself is also effect of itself. In linking the two concepts, Hegel uses again the interpretative grid of Kant's teleological judgment. Causa sui, or immanent cause, is understood as intelligent cause, and effectus sui is thought as innere Wirkungen, internal effects. Substance produces itself and is as causa sui finis sui, that is, the totality is its own cause and end. As such, totality is idea or infinite concept or organism. In light of this interpretation of the concept of substance, it becomes possible to understand how Hegel is able to develop in the subjective logic an immanent critique of Spinoza's philosophy. Because this concept is no longer Spinoza's concept of substance that cannot become subject, insofar as it was conceived precisely as the deconstruction of the theoretical field of anthropocentric prejudice. On the contrary, substance, as Hegel intends it, can become subject because it is latently such ab origine, in its fundamental structure as meaning and end. However, despite this heterodox conception of subjectivity, it gives a direction to substance, a history, an end, which was rejected in Spinoza's substance. Like Macbeth's life, Spinoza's substance is the narrative of an idiot full of noise and furor, but deprived of meaning, assuming that one gives up the anthropomorphic image of madness and narration. However, the fact that Spinoza's substance has no meaning does not entail that it is not unintelligible. The very notion of intelligibility marks a split between Spinoza's theory and Hegel's interpretation of it. For Spinoza, what is real is intelligible. For Hegel, what is real is rational. Hegel's betrayal is perpetrated in the internal shift in Spinoza's Darstellung of a fundamental concept, that of infinite intellect. And Spinoza, the intellect is an infinite mode of the attribute of thought, thus an immanent effect of divine causality, natura naturata. This means that meaning is an effect, thought infinite insofar as divine productivity is infinite, and thus at the beginning there was not logos, but action, to use Goethe's translation. The world is intelligible, and the infinite intellect is the ontological foundation of this intelligibility. Uses Kant's hypothesis of the critique of judgment in a constitutive way, Hegel displays the infinite intellect from natura naturata to natura naturans, shifting it from infinite modes to infinite attributes, to God directly. The world is rational, and the infinite intellect, or the idea, is the cause of this rationality. Hegel's interpretation of Spinoza is thus a betrayal of the theory of substance as a process without a subject, to use a Serrano category. And yet, this betrayal becomes the genial creation of a new concept, the concept of organic totality. Substance is an organized being, simultaneously cause and effect of itself, and whose teleological structure where parts are interrelated under control of the whole, is testimony of the non-mechanical causality of the concept. I'm quoting Canguilhem. This notion of organism is in Kant a merely regulative one, because Kant does not leave room for an identification of the logical framework of naturalists with the, let's say, poetic framework of natura naturans. And it is precisely at this point that Hegel introduces the Spinozian concept of causa sui in his creative organicist declination, making it function in such a way that the concept would be both knowledge and radical origination of beings, to use Leibniz expression. Thank you.
Thank you, Vittorio. Okay, we have one more presenter for this panel. So lastly, we have Cesare Casarino, who's professor of cultural studies and comparative literature at the University of Minnesota. His talk today is called On No Method for the Damned, Spinoza, Fanon, Macherey. And this is part of a current book project on Spinoza. So.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much, Dylan, Joseph, Nejat, for having invited me and for organizing this conference. What I'm going to read today is very much work in progress. It is only the beginning of a chapter in a book that I've been writing, a book tentatively titled Spinoza and the Damned, where the damned is a direct reference to Frantz Fanon, Les Damnés de la Terre. This means, among other things, that I come around to discussing Pierre Macherey's Hegel or Spinoza only at the very end, even though everything I say here is very much indebted to this book, to Macherey's book. In order to contextualize what I'm going to be reading, I'd like to tell you just a couple of things about the larger project, my book on Spinoza and the Damned. So first of all, in this book, I start from the hypothesis that the 20th century Spinoza revival finds one of its crucial causes in the international revolutionary movements that were spearheaded by the struggles against European colonialism and Western imperialism, and that came to a head in the 1960s and 1970s. However else it shall be accounted for in the future annals of the history of philosophy, Spinoza's return onto the contemporary philosophical stage will need to be understood also as integral part of a revolutionary zeitgeist that was inspired and propelled, first of all, by Les Damnés de la Terre and by the surging wave of third world liberation movements. Think, for example, of how important the Algerian War was for many of the thinkers who contributed to the Spinoza revival. So in this book, I try to read Spinoza from the standpoint of this hypothesis. The second thing I want to say about the book is that the central chapter of the book consists of a very detailed close reading of Letter 17, a letter, as you know, in which Spinoza recounts an hallucination he had of a black, leprous Brazilian man. I read this letter not as marginal or incidental, but as central to Spinoza's entire philosophical system. In this context, I also read the secondary literatures on this letter, that is the reception of this letter, as symptomatic of philosophy's bad conscience when dealing with its complicity, as it were, in the dark side of Western capitalist modernity, especially with respect to the category of race. So here I begin my talk. At a crucial juncture in the introduction to Black Skin, White Masks, Frantz Fanon abruptly presents the reader with a terse statement on method. And I quote, "It is in good taste to preface a psychological study with a methodological standpoint. We shall break with custom. We leave methods to the botanists and mathematicians. There is a point where methods are resorbed. That is where we would like to place ourselves. We shall attempt to discover the various positions the Black man adopts in the face of white civilization. End of quote. This passage well encapsulates the epistemological scandal of this epoch-making work. On the threshold of his investigation into the psychological devastation that racism inflicts on Black people everywhere, Fanon, a Black intellectual and scientist, trained in and practicing psychiatry, bids farewell to method. An interpretation of this passage as a farewell to method, however, begs more questions than it answers. Why does this work need to start by abandoning method? What exactly is the point at which methods are resorbed, and why does Fanon want to place himself there? What does it mean for methods to be resorbed in the first place? Who are these botanists and mathematicians? And finally, what method? I shall return to this specific passage and to the questions it provokes shortly. First, let us step back a moment and say a few words about black skin, white masks. Much has been written on how this is a strange, uncategorizable, truly singular book. For our purposes, it is instructive to turn to Pierre Macherey's characterization of the unique features of this book. When first introducing black skin, white masks in his essay, quotes, Figures of Interpellation in Althusser and Fanon, end of quote, Macherey defines this book notably by negation. Quote, it is a work of neither philosophy nor political theory, end of quote. Macherey adds that Fanon, quote, had planned to make it his thesis in medicine, end of quote, thereby suggesting that it was not really a work of medical science either. If this is at all a work of science, the science in question, Macherey is implying, does not belong in the human, the social, or the natural sciences. The science of disalienation, where disalienation is the term Fanon uses whenever indicating the ultimate aim of his work, is either not exactly a science in the sense of those other sciences, or a science of emancipation and liberation that is yet to come and yet to be defined, or both. Macherey, in any case, introduces this book not by telling us what it is, but by telling us what it is not, which I take as a sign of just how illegible Fanon's project is when read from the standpoint of established disciplinary knowledge. Indeed, Macherey also tells us that this book is written, quote, in a style uncommon among academics, end of quote, which, after having suggested that it does not fit anywhere in disciplinary knowledge, is somewhat of an anticlimactic understatement. It is also in this context that Macherey invokes W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, and in particular the concept of double consciousness elaborated therein, as constituting the crucial precursor for black skin, white masks. Without pointing out, however, that Du Bois's book is a crucial precursor here also in another respect. Much like Fanon, when faced with the daunting task of expressing the lived experience of blackness, Du Bois, a black intellectual and academic, trained as a social scientist, abandons the stylistic and methodological conventions of academic discourse, thereby producing a book that famously resists any categorization whatsoever. Even without highlighting the affinity between the two books at the level of form, however, Macherey's point is clear. Black Skin, White Masks defies modern disciplinary taxonomy and constitutes a radically anti-disciplinary work. Fanon's farewell to method is integral to such an anti-disciplinary stance and is tantamount to an implicit indictment of disciplinary knowledge. Fanon would prefer, quote, to leave methods to the botanists and mathematicians, end of quote. It is not far-fetched to suppose that this is a reference to the father of modern botany, namely Carl Linnaeus, whose Systema Naturae of 1735 includes one of the first examples of the modern concept of race as biological category and of the hierarchical taxonomy of races that is attendant to and constitutive of this concept. If so, Fanon is indicating that scientific method is at the very least implicated in racism. And with respect to the mathematicians, this is an easier guess. It would be hard to fathom that Fanon did not have also René Descartes in mind, consciously or unconsciously, when writing this sentence. Whatever else Fanon is doing in this passage, he's positing a break with the father of modern scientific method, a break with the long-standing tradition of the Cartesian method. As Fanon writes in the chapter on the lived experience of the black man, quote, "It's in the name of tradition, of the long historical past, and of the blood ties with Pascal and Descartes that the Jews are told you will never belong here," end of quote. Given the many parallels drawn between Jews and blacks in this chapter, one can assume that Descartes functions as a gatekeeper for blacks too. Such are the fathers and masters whom Fanon rejects because he's rejected in their name, and whom Fanon leaves behind when abandoning method. But breaking with the Cartesian tradition, that is, doing away with the customary methodological preface, as well as leaving method to botanists, mathematicians, and other assorted scientists, is not enough for Fanon. To all of this, he adds an enigmatic formulation, quote, "There is a point where methods are resorbed. That is where we would like to place ourselves," end of quote. To resorb, résorber in the original, is a term in physiology. This is not the last time we encounter specialized scientific terminology in black skin, white masks. Medical and biological metaphors in particular abound throughout this work. The process of resorption occurs when a substance or a group of cells, for example, cancerous tissue, is first broken down into its component materials and is then dispersed and put back into circulation. Resorption takes place when something internal is destroyed and absorbed by the body. Think of it as corporeal recycling. Is method a tumor in the body of knowledge? Are there circumstances under which the body of knowledge may be able to assimilate and subsume this internal anomaly? One doesn't need to take this metaphor so literally, as it were, to surmise that in this sentence, A, method is an epistemological aberration, and B, something prior to and larger than method is being posited, without which, otherwise, method could not be resorbed. Both A and B point to the logical and chronological primacy of knowledge over method, which is undoubtedly the reason why Fanon shall not preface his psychological study with a methodology. The break with Cartesianism is necessary because the latter puts the methodological cart before the epistemological horse, thereby confusing causes with effects. For Fanon, the final word on method is that knowledge comes first. The break with Cartesianism is not enough for Fanon in the sense that such a break should not be understood as avoidance, but precisely as resorption, as destruction and absorption. Abandoning method does not mean to ignore it, to circumvent it, to wish it away. Abandoning method entails, rather, tarrying with it by taking it apart piece by piece, disassembling it, and then producing different assemblages with its parts. For Fanon, it is only by transforming method radically that one may hope really to leave it behind. Fanon, after all, does not position himself after or beyond method. Rather, he wants to place himself there where method is resorbed. His psychological phenomenology of blackness is undertaken not from the standpoint of an absence or foreclosure of method, but from the standpoint of its ongoing metamorphosis. This is why, after having taken his leave from method in the passage above, Fanon returns to the question of method repeatedly throughout the book. It's not that the break needs to be reenacted over and over again. It's rather that the very notion of breaking with method is redefined as the process of breaking method down into its structural elements and recombining each of these elements towards a rather different pursuit. It might be tempting to understand resorption as akin to sublation, but as I hope to make clear, such an understanding would overly simplify Fanon's project in Black Skin, White Masks. Okay, here I'm going to skip over about 10 pages or so 10 pages on Fanon and Descartes specifically, in which I show how this resorption of method takes place. In particular, here I show how Fanon critiques and immanentizes three transcendent relations that constitute key features of the Cartesian method, namely the relation between subject of knowledge and object of knowledge, the relation between the subjective and the objective and its attendant notion of scientific objectivity, and the relation between mind and body. Okay, now I start rereading after these 10 pages. If such a resorption of Descartes sounds familiar, that is because it bears a striking resemblance to the first response to the Cartesian system. Fanon's confrontation with Cartesianism in Black Skin, White Mask has a precedent in Spinoza. All the vast differences and historical divides notwithstanding, I argue that Fanon's and Spinoza's critical engagements with Descartes are in fact very similar. Here, I will encapsulate only 3 points of convergence between Fanon and Spinoza, which I have only hinted at so far. 1. Much like Spinoza, Fanon responds to the Cartesian transcendence of mind over body in a way that may give the impression of privileging the body over the mind, but that actually articulates their immanence. Spinoza may give this impression to the extent to which he argues that in order for there to be a mind, there has to be a body first, given that he defines the mind as the idea of the body. This may lead us to think of the body as having seniority over the mind, as it were, but for Spinoza, this is a matter of logical rather than chronological precedence. For Spinoza, body and mind are not only immanent, further, he states that they are two different words for the same entity. There's in scholium to proposition 21 of part 2 and scholium to proposition 2 of part 3 in the Ethics. Now, in the introduction, Fanon tells us that Black Skin, White Masks is a psychological study, namely an investigation into the mind, and then proceeds to focus on the body repeatedly throughout this work. Reading through this book, one notes that the level of the somatic is ubiquitous throughout a work that nonetheless purports to grapple with and focus on the level of the psychic. There is no contradiction here. It is not despite, but because of the fact that this work starts and continually starts from the level of the somatic, that it is able to engage with the level of the psychic at all. Fanon shows how this investigation of the mind needs not only to engage with the body, but needs also to posit the body as the path to the mind, because there is simply no other path to it. This is so due to this work's ultimate aim, namely disalienation. The struggle against racial alienation, which, like any form of alienation, is mental by definition, starts from and foregrounds the corporeal, because racial oppression is founded on and targets the corporeal as marker of racial difference. Or, as Fanon puts it, quote, the black man is attacked in his corporeality, end of quote. Racism exploits the immanence of body and mind while foreclosing it. On the one hand, racism works because body and mind are immanent. On the other hand, racism needs to perpetuate the cult of the mind's transcendence over the body, to the extent to which racism itself is a transcendence of the definitionally white mind over the definitionally black body. A preliminary task of disalienation, thus, involves revealing and asserting this immanence everywhere, rather than foreclosing it. Disalienation, understood as emancipation from racial alienation, must consist of a liberation of the body that is, at one and the same time, a liberation of the mind. Fanon is telling us that the effects of racism cannot be understood, leave alone disalienated, unless these two levels are understood as strictly immanent. Or, put differently, for Fanon, racism would result incomprehensible or altogether invisible if one were to look at it from the standpoint of the Cartesian mind-body dualism. Let us not forget, after all, that Black Skin, White Masks ends with the following exclamation, quote, "My final prayer, O my body, always make me a man who questions," end of quote. Far from constituting a flight into transcendence, namely merely a substitution of transcendent body for transcendent mind, this prayer to the body constitutes a reversal and a displacement of the Cartesian mind-body binary opposition, and hence gestures to a deconstruction of the Cartesian problematic. And I do mean deconstruction here in the strict sense given to this term by Jacques Derrida in signature event context, among other places. What is reversed in this final prayer is the hierarchy of the mind-body binary. It is the body here that takes the place of honor. And had the prayer stopped at that, it would indeed have achieved no more than another flight into transcendence. But the entire problematic is also displaced. Arguably, the man who always questions is the quintessential figure of the Cartesian subject. Here, thus, the defining essence of the Cartesian subject, namely always questioning, is revealed to depend upon the powers and the good graces of the body. Clearly, this body has a mind of its own. Clearly, the aspiring Cartesian subject of this prayer is no longer Cartesian to the extent to which the subject acknowledges and affirms its corporeal Ursprung rather than foreclosing it. It seems that the deconstruction of the Cartesian mind-body dualism leads Fanon to something like a materialist faith, a spirituality of the corporeal, a metaphysics of the physical that is not at all far from Spinoza. In expressing the lived experience of racism, Fanon has pushed us to the very edge of the abyss of immanence. Two, much like Spinoza, Fanon transfigures the relations between subject and object, as well as between subjectivity and objectivity that are presupposed and fostered by the Cartesian method. As we saw earlier, on the one hand, Fanon rejects scientific objectivity when analyzing the lived experience of racism, including and especially his own experience. And on the other hand, Fanon believes that subjective experience can be understood by all, and hence that it has an objectivity of its own. The project of disalienation necessarily involves both an epistemological position in which the subject is his own object, as well as a rejection of scientific objectivity in favor of an investigation into the objectivity of the subjective. If this is a fair rendition of Fanon's project, it may sound odd when referred to Spinoza. One can hardly imagine the latter rejecting scientific objectivity, for example. For Spinoza, arguably, the very exercise of reason is synonymous with scientific objectivity, while the exercise of the imagination constitutes the realm of the subjective by definition. But for Spinoza, it is also the case that neither imagination nor reason is the end of the story, and that there is a type of knowledge higher than both, namely intuition, which allows us to know the essence of things, the essence of modes, namely their conatus, by deducing them from the essence of God, the essence of substance, namely from existence itself. For Spinoza, we ought to make our way through imagination and reason toward intuition, without any guarantee of reaching a destination. Spinoza characterizes this project as one of emancipation. We are slaves to the set passions and to the vagaries of the imagination, and intuition constitutes the highest form of liberation from such an enslavement. And the first step towards liberating ourselves from our set passions is to understand them, to understand their causes, which is another way of saying that this first step entails submitting the imagination to the scrutiny of reason. But understanding our set passions and their causes means understanding ourselves, that is, understanding who we are when we are affected by the set passions, so as to become different. In short, Spinoza's project of liberation is inseparable from self-knowledge, that is, from an operation of thought in which the subject of knowledge continuously turns himself into the object of knowledge so as to apprehend the objectivity of the subjective and so as to change it. Incidentally, in Spinozian terms, the objectivity of the subjective corresponds to the epistemological status of the imagination qua false knowledge. For Spinoza, the false can only be relatively rather than absolutely false, and hence to conceive of the imagination as false knowledge means to grant that the imagination is knowledge rather than not, that the imagination is a positive form of knowledge rather than absolute negation of knowledge, absolute falsehood. If the imagination is the subjective, thus, there is always an objectivity in the subjective that can be known by all. What I am suggesting is that Spinoza's and Fanon's projects are similar to the extent to which they are not only projects of liberation, but also projects of liberation from ourselves. For both Fanon and Spinoza, such a project, while not excluding other forms of liberation, such as liberation from others, is nonetheless necessary in and of itself, as well as complementary and essential to any liberation whatsoever. In the introduction, Fanon writes, quote, "We aim at nothing less than to liberate the black man from himself," end of quote. In chapter 2, Fanon adds, quote, "Both the black man, slave to his inferiority, and the white man, slave to his superiority, behave along neurotic lines," end of quote. Both the white subject of racism and the black object of racism are slaves to the said passions and need to liberate themselves from their own racist neuroses. For both Spinoza and Fanon, such a liberation constitutes nothing less than symbolic death. These slaves must die so as to be reborn and come into being as subjects of self-knowledge, that is, as subject of self-determination, in short, as subjects of reason. This metamorphosis into subjects of reason is certainly a necessary step, as well as an improvement on being slaves to the racist imagination. But it does not solve the problem of alienation entirely, since it is still dependent on a now fully internalized subject-object split, which constitutes the fons and origo of alienation in the first place. To be done with alienation would mean to overcome that split, since as long as there are subjects and objects, including non-racist ones, there is always the possibility that the hierarchy, which is always intrinsic and latent in subject-object relations, may return to haunt us in a different form, if not in a racist form, then through other forms of oppression and exploitation. I am suggesting that disalienation in Fanon and intuition in Spinoza are different terms expressing a very similar desire, namely the desire to think a type of knowledge without either a subject of knowledge or an object of knowledge, the desire for a world without either subjects or objects, which within the parameters of modern Western thought is an absurdity. In both Fanon and Spinoza, in any case, liberation is above all liberation from Cartesian subjects and Cartesian objects. 3. Most importantly, it is the very concept of method, as articulated by Descartes and as handed down by the Cartesian tradition, that Spinoza and Fanon contest in similar ways. Both undo the Cartesian method by positing the immanence of method and knowledge, as well as the logical and chronological primacy of knowledge over method. In making this claim, I'm crucially indebted to Pierre Macherey's study, Hegel or Spinoza, and in particular to the remarkable chapter on method in that work. There, Macherey shows how Spinoza's response to Cartesian method consists of a displacement and a re-evaluation of method. A displacement in the sense that method is reconceived by Spinoza as an effect of knowledge rather than as its cause, and hence as coming into being in the wake of knowledge. And a re-evaluation that in effect consists of a devalorization in the sense that in Spinoza, quote, method has lost the juridical function of guarantee that it is assigned in the Cartesian theory of knowledge, and no longer has the power to assign its originary conditions to truth, but it engages some of its properties after the fact, end of quote. Spinoza's deployment of the geometrical method does not contradict such a displacement and devalorization due to the fact that, according to Macherey, quote, more geometrico is not another method, a new order of exposition, but precisely something other than method, end of quote. Or, as I've called it in the case of Fanon, a non-method. The point in any case is not only that what Macherey argues about Spinoza's understanding of method is applicable mutatis mutandis to Fanon. The point is also that Macherey himself seems to have sensed this affinity with respect to the question of method between Spinoza and Fanon. In Figures of Interpolation in Althusser and Fanon, Macherey tells us the black skin, white masks asks the following question, quote, what is it exactly to be black? End of quote. This has all the appearances of an ontological question. But Macherey parses this question further, quote, how does the fact of being the bearer of the qualifier black fundamentally modify the fact of being to the point of turning the project of ontology on its head? End of quote. What does Macherey mean exactly by implying that Fanon turns, quote, the project of ontology on its head, end of quote? And is this overturning or reversal of ontology something that he would attribute also to Spinoza? In Hegel or Spinoza, Macherey handles Spinoza's reversal of the Cartesian order of method, which understands method to precede and produce knowledge, as an epistemological rather than an ontological intervention. And yet, this epistemological intervention is so momentous that it involves also significant ontological ripple effects, if not a full-fledged ontological tsunami. For example, when Macherey argues that Spinoza's deployment of the geometrical method in effect turns the latter into, quote, something other than method, end of quote, the stakes are eminently ontological. What is at stake in this deployment for Macherey, in fact, is the genesis of substance. In short, it is not far-fetched to suppose that for Macherey, Spinoza's reversal of the Cartesian order of method has important ontological repercussions and entails ontological reversals of its own. But even if we make Macherey say that both Fanon and Spinoza overturn ontology, that does not mean that they do so in the same way necessarily. Let's return to Fanon. In what way does he turn the project of ontology on its head? For Macherey, Fanon's question, what is it exactly to be black, is not a question that can be properly formulated, let alone answered, if one follows, quote, the ordinary criteria of ontological analysis, end of quote. Which criteria, I would add, demand that ontology remain focused on essences. Indeed, Fanon writes, quote, as soon as we acknowledge once and for all that ontology leaves existence by the wayside, we realize that ontology does not allow us to understand the being of the black man. For not only must the black man be black, he must be black in the presence of the white man, end of quote. It is only by focusing on existence that one may discern the truth, that is, the essence of racism as relational structure, which is why, presumably, Fanon turns to phenomenology and to its focus on existence rather than to ontological speculations in black skin, white masks. Commenting on this passage, Macherey writes, and I quote, in the singular figure that the designation being black connotes, it is not simply being, but also a certain manner of not being, of being defective, that is at stake. But what is it that it is lacking? What is lacking is that irrefutable, indelible mark of colorlessness that whiteness would be. What the lived experience of the black man reveals is therefore the limit that speculation on the subject of being qua being encounters. Speculation that is incapable of accounting for what being is in the specific case in which being is also being qua not being, end of quote. The point is that being qua being is absolute, whereas being black is relative and relational. It is only by starting from and considering existence, which is to say lived experience and its countless racist interpolations, that one may be able to understand that being in being black is also not being white, that the being of being black is relational and is experienced as relative being by all concerned, while the being of being white is also relational and relative, but is disguised, presented, and experienced as absolute being. It seems to me that Spinoza's ontology is perfectly capable of handling this type of problem. As a matter of fact, this being that is also being qua not being does have a name in Spinoza. He calls it mode. And modal being is always relative and relational in the sense that even the most self-determined of modes is also determined negatively by its myriad contingent encounters with other modes. A mode is what it is, always in relation to other modes, that is, always in relation to what it is not. Speculation on being qua being without consideration of existence has no place in Spinoza's ontology. Even when concerning substance, which indeed for Spinoza constitutes being qua being and is absolute, it is difficult, if not impossible, to qualify and think its determinations without considering the modal world, given that there is no gap or remainder whatsoever between substance and modes, and given that hence there is strictly no difference between positing substance as absolutely self-determined and positing substance as being continuously determined and redetermined by modes. Besides, how can Spinoza's ontology ever leave existence by the wayside, like the ontology Fanon rejects, when for Spinoza the essence of substance is existence itself? In short, it seems to me that in principle, Spinoza's ontology is at the very least compatible with Macherey's account of Fanon's overturning of ontology. To conclude briefly, why are Fanon's and Spinoza's responses to Cartesianism similar? What are we to make of this affinity across otherwise immensely different contexts and conjunctures? These are the questions that I would like to be able to answer eventually. We know that Fanon owned a copy of Spinoza's Ethics. We also know that when studying philosophy alongside medicine at the University of Lyon, he attended the lectures of Jean Lacroix, who wrote a monograph on Spinoza, among other things. But this is not what interests me, however. The point is not to argue that Spinoza influenced Fanon. I am more concerned with using Fanon to read Spinoza differently. I'm more concerned with how to read Spinoza after Fanon. I am interested in showing that even without evidence of direct influence of Spinoza on Fanon, the similarities between Spinoza and Fanon are not a coincidence, and in fact, share in common a set of causes that are both historical and conceptual. In responding to Cartesianism, both Spinoza and Fanon destroy and absorb method in the attempt to produce a non-method, namely disalienation or intuition. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Cesare. So we have, according to our schedule, we should take a short 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we can have a Q&A for 30 minutes. So we'll take a short 5-minute break, collect your thoughts, and we'll be right back. Yeah, we should get started again. So we have a few questions now. Okay, so yeah, so we have a few questions. let's see. Okay, we'll start with Cesare, who has a question for Vittorio.
Vittorio, you demonstrated convincingly that Hegel reads Spinoza through Kant. But as you very well know, around 1800, it is quite typical to turn Kantian regulative principles, such as organic totality, or intellectual intuition or intuitive understanding, into ontological principles. So this is what I see that Hegel is doing. What I wanted to ask is there something specific about Hegel, something singular about Hegel that is not enveloped in this tendency around 1800 to transgress the limits of Kant's critique, that is to say, to take what in Critique of Judgment, for example, Kant posits as regulative principles into ontological postulates? Is there something, or is Hegel simply the most consequential thinker, the one that most consequentially read Spinoza in this way, or is there something particular or singular about it?
I reply immediately, or?
Yes, please.
Okay. See, I think that, of course, is a tendency that you can find also in Schelling, and we can say that in Jena in the first years, Schelling and Hegel have a common thought. They have a common project, if not a common system. But it seems to me that in Glauben und Wissen, there is an identification of the philosophy. Hegel identifies his philosophy with Spinoza. It is interesting the way, of course, I haven't entered the detail of the reading that are very interesting, but it seems to me that there is a reading of Spinoza through the concept of archetypical intellect and transcendental imagination, thought together as creative imagination. And this in the direction, if you want to, you can find this also in Schelling, something like this. But in Schelling, you have a great valorization of the parallelism between the two realms of thought and nature. And it seems to me that in Hegel, there is a strong reading of Spinoza's substance in the sense of the teleological judgment, thought as organism, as totality. And this is something different from Schelling. You can, if you take the text of Hegel, the different Schrift, and you compare this with Glauben und Wissen, in the first text, Hegel is, I don't know how to say, proximo, near the philosophy of Schelling. And in Glauben und Wissen, it seems to me that there is an original position. And it's very important because this concept of substance as organism is something that remains in the Hegelian system and the Macherey system. If you think to the, for example, ethical substance is thought as an organism, and you cannot think that without this without this misunderstanding of Spinoza, that is a creation of the new concept.
Okay, thank you. So we have a few questions for Cesare, so I'll read them. So first, in letter 17, we read, the effects of the imagination arise from the constitution either of the body or of the mind. Spinoza is alluding to a bodily imagination. How do you see this imagination relating to the question, what is it to be Black in a racist society? To what extent can such imagination be liberatory? Also, how do you see a bodily imagination relating to this desire of a knowledge without objects and subjects? And I'll read one more. Given Fanon's indebtedness to Merleau-Ponty's concept of lived experience, another anti-Cartesian philosopher, what would be the latter space in the problem we are discussing today? How would a phenomenology of perception be placed alongside the intuitive knowledge ethics of Spinoza that dismantles both subject and the object?
So regarding the first question you read, Joseph, to what extent can the imagination, as Spinoza articulates it in that letter, to what extent such imagination can be liberatory? Probably not to a large extent. Certainly, imagination is not enough by itself. However, there is a link, a connection between the imagination and the third kind of knowledge in Spinoza. This is something that has been said in various ways by Deleuze, but Geneviève Lloyd also points to this at several points in her work. Namely, the way Geneviève Lloyd puts it is very succinct. Basically, she explains how the imagination wants to get at the essence of things, at singularities, but does it inadequately, whereas the third kind of knowledge does it adequately. But in a sense, imagination and intuition share the same aim, same purpose. But one does it well and one does it badly or incorrectly, falsely, and so on. So to the extent to which there is this link between the two, then there is also, one could also say that one can find in the imagination this thing that I called a desire for a knowledge without subject of knowledge and object of knowledge. Only that the imagination cannot do without thinking the world without subjects and objects. So it's a kind of catch-22 there. There's much more to say about this question, but I think I'll stop there for the moment. The letter 17 gets very complicated that way. What was the other question? Oh, Merleau-Ponty. What is the space of Merleau-Ponty here? I'm not sure yet. I hadn't really thought it through, frankly. It's something that I need to work more on. It seems to me, however, that the Fanon's phenomenological project is, or let me put it the other way around. Fanon's use of phenomenology is very strategic and very, in a sense, utilitarian. What I mean by that is that he's interested in using phenomenology really to go beyond it or to do something different. I think even in Merleau-Ponty, phenomenological thought is still too linked to concepts such as subject and object, even though in the very late Merleau-Ponty that seems to be, overcome. Or in any case, the concept of the flesh is certainly an attempt to overcome that opposition. But Fanon is interested from the get-go, I think, to get there, to get to a point at which we wouldn't have to think about relations, human relations, in those terms anymore. So yeah, that's all I can say right now about the Merleau-Ponty's place in this.
Okay, thank you. See, we have another question from Cesare. I think this is for Cesare. It seems like the issues raised by the interventions of Fanon regarding what Lenin called the three sources of Marxism: German idealism, French socialism, and Kant, and political economy, the Scots, Ricardo, and Ricardians, including James Mill, on the non-European and non-white via the subject-object dichotomy, and how this relates to the epistemological break that Althusser and his circle discuss in Reading Capital. How might the reading of Fanon with Spinoza via Macherey and Hegel and Spinoza enable us to think through the emergence of the concept of ideology in Marx and its various conceptions in Marxism regarding the relations between social structure, antagonism, and thought? For Cesare, but others can jump in as well.
Yeah. Wow, this is a really crucial question. I don't know that I have anything to say about it right now, though. It's something I really would need to think more about. Regarding the relation between social structure, antagonism, and thought. Yeah, no, I don't think I can approach this yet. I recognize the importance of this question. It's extremely important, but I don't have an answer for it right now.
Okay, no problem. So we have time for more questions. I'll bring up something that you talked about, Cesare, and that relates to some of the things others were saying. So on this question of method, which is the title, part of the title of your talk. In fact, I wanted to put your title in the chat so people can see just how it's written actually.
Thank you. I should have done that myself.
Yeah. So let me put that in so everyone can see. Okay, so this is Cesare's title on /no method for the damned. So this question of method, you brought up that one of the criticisms that Macherey makes is that it has this sort of juridical function. And I wanted to bring that up because I thought it brought us back to Etienne's talk on truth and error and the relationship between truth and error, this idea that error is the sort of shadowy other of truth that Spinoza unsettles. And it was making me think of Althusser's lecture from the early 60s on psychoanalysis and the human sciences, which have been translated recently, where Althusser sort of traces this history from, on the one hand, Plato to Descartes, especially, and on the other hand, Spinoza and Lacan. And what Althusser is sort of getting at is the way that Spinoza sort of unsettles this conception of error as the sort of other of truth in a way that really emphasizes the juridical function of error. And so one of the important concepts that Althusser introduces there that I don't think he discusses elsewhere is the subject of imputation. And one of the things you brought up, Cesare, was the way Spinoza and Fanon think about, express this idea of, express this sort of a liberation from the self. And with Spinoza, there's also a liberation from the Cartesian subject. So I wanted to raise that up to see if we could talk maybe about the role that the notion of error, understood as the other, the shadowy other, of truth, plays in this sort of juridical conception of, I guess, the subject as well as the human, for that matter.
I'm not sure. I mean, this is something that came up also in Kiarina Kordela's talk. I mean, the point is that in Spinoza there is a displacement of these binaries in such a way that you cannot oppose them anymore to each other, right? So error, in that sense, needs to be understood as not only part of truth but constitutive of it, even in some ways, or in any case something that truth cannot do without. Or put paradoxically, let's put it the other way around. Can one think a concept of truth without error? Can one, in fact, even think in Spinoza a concept of knowledge that would be only and just truth? There couldn't be such a thing. Hence the the constitutive function. I don't know if constitutive is exactly the word I want, but the constitutive function of error there. I'm not sure how this relates, though, to this connection that I'm trying to make between Spinoza and Fanon. I'm not sure, in fact, it does relate to this, because imagination is the side of error on the one hand, but the side of error in precisely this, in this sense, that it also is constitutive of the truth. So no,
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and so if Kiarina or Etienne would also like to respond, please do. Etienne?
Let Kiarina speak first, if she wants.
Yeah, thank you, then. I think that the point, I'm not sure, but I think that the point of the question, the last question, was, okay, yes, given that the relationship between truth and false is what all of us have been saying, where does the concept of the legislative fit? Was it legislative? What did you call that? That methodology? Juridical, sorry, exactly. So is that when you use the term juridical, does the term juridical have a specific relationship to it's not an either or? Is it, does it relate differently to the truth than to the false? I think that was the point of the question. Yeah, just to help you, Cesare, to continue.
The question of the juridical is very much, is very much is very related, is very important for the conception of method that Descartes has, in the sense that for Descartes, method is a guarantee of truth. In that sense, it's a juridical understanding of method, or there is a juridical aspect to method there. I don't see that aspect in Spinoza at all, neither in Fanon. That's why I feel that category there, this question of a juridical guarantee of truth, where method. Yeah, go ahead.
So you are saying when you use the term juridical, you imply the term juridical in itself presupposes an opposition in the traditional sense of the word between truth and false. Well, exactly. Therefore, okay. I think this clarifies. I don't know. Who asked the question, whether it clarifies what they meant. Etienne, thank you for letting me.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Three points or quick ideas that come to my mind, while listening to this beautiful discussion. And first of all, thank you all, Vittorio, Kiarina, and Cesare, for making these problems so acute. I'm especially delighted that Kiarina brought in Lacan. Of course, we would expect that from her acquaintance with him. And you, Joseph, a minute ago referred to posthumous paper by Althusser. There's something I didn't completely grasp because of the sound of my ears. You said that Althusser in this paper speaks of a subject of what? Subject of
imputation.
Imputation.
Imputation. Oh, very interesting. Yes, of course. Yes. What the first thing that comes to my mind is that bringing in Lacan, I mean, Althusser, of course, in all these discussions about epistemology and the question of method that Macherey helped create, as I tried to explain, and that he also, of course, later pursued or pushed further, had a kind of fiercely anti-Cartesian motto and guiding thread. Incidentally, I may return to this in a minute. I fear, and increasingly so, that many of these discussions are based, I would say, if not on the construction of a straw man, you know, or bearing the name Descartes, but who in fact is based, I wouldn't say on a wrong, on a mistaken, on a false reading, but on a partial reading. And that's especially true, of course, for I would say something like the connection or the I know I'm very quick, but the articulation of Descartes' idea of the method in the discourse, or it's his definition of the method, and the seeming indication that the method must come first in order for the whole process of knowledge that is going to follow to be based on certainty, I mean, on firm basis. Add to this kind of also very traditional understanding of the idea of the cogito as an ontological basis for the pure identification of the subject with the function of consciousness. I mean, something like that. And you get the Descartes who is the target of, I would say, a kind of array or converging refutations in which you enroll, and I'm caricaturing a little bit, but the early Althusserianism was a little bit of that, I mean, and more than a little bit. You enroll Spinoza, you enroll Hegel, you enroll Freud, and possibly Lacan as a reader of Freud. Now, something, and if I may, and Marx, of course, and Marx, or Marx re-elaborated, and Marx's theory of ideology re-elaborated on the basis of these old readings. I vividly remember a session of a small seminar, a kind of private seminar that Lacan had proposed to organize for Althusser students, among which I was after we had spent 1 year reading his text, his very enigmatic text, and at the end he spoke about Descartes. This is now very well known, of course, because it's the last section of the 1964 something seminar on the fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, which entirely ends with Descartes. And so he had presented that, and as as a good little boy, little student of Althusser, I said to him, "Sir, or doctor, we called him doctor, would you agree to explain would you agree that the theory of the subject of the unconscious that you are proposing us is a perfect foundation for a critical theory of ideology or something like that, you know? And he smiled in a not contemptuous, but slightly, of course, paternalistic manner. And he said, if that pleases you, I mean, if you like that idea, why not? I mean, go ahead. But in fact, the huge contradiction would lied in the fact that Lacan was not attacking the Cartesian subject. I mean, he was reinterpreting the Cartesian subject in terms of, as we know, and of point of radical uncertainty. On which an epistemology of psychoanalysis and its practice needed to be based. And this came, of course, from the fact that the subject dealt with in the practice, in the cure, is I would say something like located within the topos or the realm of its own fantasies, and therefore there's no possibility to perform something like the Spinozistic epistemological break that Althusser was claiming to introduce. So in fact, Lacan never ceased to try and explain to Althusser that he didn't understand very well what the articulation of the practice and the theory would be in psychoanalysis. After which, of course, Althusser struggled with that all his life and said very interesting things. Now, this is one side of Lacan which we cannot spare, and the other side, of course, is the one that Kiarina beautifully. I don't say they are incompatible, they're not exactly the same, that Kiarina brought to the fore in a crucial moment of her presentation when she quoted the formula, God is the unconscious, I mean, or is unconscious, I mean, as an indication of the fact that consciousness is not the other of the unconscious in some radical sense, but it's part of the unconscious. I mean, it's a moment in the history and the development of the unconscious. Now, that is, of course, not without. I'll finish with that. I leave the third point. It is not without relations to the kind of dilemmas that I was trying to bring to the fore a little painfully, I have to admit, returning to the strange, I would say, displacements of the Verum index et falsi between Macherey and Althusser and then back and so on. Because in fact, they leave the possibility, I would say, of three strategic attitudes, and the concept of error can no longer be the same. First, call it Cartesian if you like, or the kind of Cartesianism that is still there in Hegel, even in very profoundly transformed manner, and that Macherey beautifully discusses. Excuse me, the idea of the method is fundamentally the idea of the negation of the negation. I mean, error is a negative phenomenon. It's a negative moment in the process of learning, knowing, etc., etc. And as a consequence, the norm, the teleology, the objective, is to overcome that negation. So either you find a way to a criterion to identify errors and putting them aside, or you incorporate their progressive negation into the whole of truth. So then there is a second possibility that is, it seems to me, the one around which Macherey earlier than Althusser, perhaps, which I, of course, find a beautiful story to tell, but probably also Althusser in the end arrived, namely the idea that because truth, or perhaps better than truth, adequacy, objectivity, etc., is nothing other than the permanent critique of the ideological condition for any knowledge, and that is not something that can be eliminated. If you dream of eliminated error in that sense, you eliminate knowledge as well, because knowledge is a permanent debate, I would say, with that error. So as a consequence, of course, it's not an equivalence, it's not a symmetry, but it's something like an infinite dialectical process. This being said, of course, error remains negatively characterized. The negative is crucial, is decisive, but it's negative. And then there is the possibility that, if, of course, anti-epistemological in a sense, certainly incompatible with any juridical or quasi-juridical understanding of knowledge, namely the idea that the substance of knowledge is erring, So that's where the crucial condition of possibility lies, not as a negative, but as a positive or affirmative condition of possibility, and that has, of course, so if you translate into Lacanese or post-Freudian language, of course, it becomes something like the objective of the cure is not to make the unconscious conscious. It's to elaborate the unconscious. And if you translate into Althusserian Marxism, etc., it becomes something that Vittorio knows that perfectly. I mean, that Althusser perhaps approached in his essay on Machiavelli, namely the objective of the political objective of the critique of ideology is not to eliminate ideology, because if you eliminate ideology, you eliminate everything: social relations, political commitments, and so on. So it's almost reversed. The process is a process, is a dialectic that is internal to error as such. Maybe it sounds, it's non-ontological, perhaps, in the sense that you, Cesare, was explaining. So I stop there because I've been talking once again much too much. But nevertheless, Cesare, allow me one point. With regard to phenomenology, I'll be very, and Merleau-Ponty, like it or not, it's not a change if people like Merleau-Ponty were particularly fascinated by another aspect of Descartes' philosophy, and Spinoza as well. I'm sure he spent his life, in a sense, thinking about that. That was not the cogito. That was not the method. That was the question of the so-called union of body and soul or mind. Now, the easy critique of this, I mean, the first level, of course, is Spinoza's devastating critique of the ontological antithesis or dualism of mind and body, because because this first doesn't provide in any solution, and second contradicts, I would say, a good concept of substance. But then comes the other, so it's ontologically unsustainable, I would say. But the other aspect of the problem, and that's why Merleau-Ponty and others, and perhaps Fanon himself, were so interested, is the phenomenological dimension of that. Because a strict Spinozist position, these are two attributes. Deleuze has very interesting ways of negotiating that. Makes it possible to write a superb logic of affects, affects and ideas, their catexis, their etc. But it doesn't say much, if any, about the form in which you live the affects. You think from within your own body, so to speak, and that is, or you think, or you experience thinking as located in the body, which is exactly what Descartes tries to do in the last part of his philosophy. So ontologically, Descartes is refuted by Spinoza, but phenomenologically, Descartes raises a question that for people like Merleau-Ponty or Fanon, because black skin, white masks is rhetorically and intimately connected to that. I think, and I experience suffering, humiliation, rebellion, etc., from within a black body. So that's a typical case of union of body and mind. Reason why it's not so easy. It's not so easy to get rid of Hegel, but it's also not so easy to get rid of Descartes, if I may say so. Sorry,
Okay, thank you very much for that. And thank you to all of the speakers today. So now we're going to take a long break and we'll resume with the second panel at 12:30 Pacific time. So yeah, so we'll take a break now. Yeah, but once again, thanks to everyone who spoke, and see you all in a bit.
Well, I'm going to text him first.